just to welcome everybody, thank you for attending. My name's Lisa Katanak. I'm the Head of Learning for the Local Government Capacity Centre here at Homes England. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of today's sessions, which are designed specifically to support local authority housing funding and housing delivery. If we can just move on to the next slide, I'll just kick off with a very quick summary of Homes England and what we do in terms of support for places and local authorities. This includes our funding programmes, such as the Affordable Homes Programme, our bespoke support to priority places, and also one-to-many capacity support, such as this event and our other learning programmes and events that we run. If we just move on to the next slide, you'll see here the agenda for today. So delighted to have both a local authority perspective from Cambridge, and before that, Steve Partridge from Savills is going to be giving you here, sharing his knowledge with you. And like I say, we'll close the session with the Q&A, posing any of those questions that you've posted in the chat. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Steve to share some knowledge around using housing revenue accounts. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see so many people on a Monday morning wanting to do a session on the housing revenue account and the financials. Homes England and Lisa have asked me to talk through a little bit of the backdrop around the housing revenue account and how we can think about using the HRA to develop new homes or acquire new homes, whether that's by the AHP or particularly in the context of this session through the Local Authority Housing Fund. So what I'm going to do is take you through a little bit of a backdrop to the HRA to kind of set the scene. And a couple of examples then of what your HRA or an HRA might look like in the context of availability of capacity for investment into new supply, whether that's through development or acquisition. A little bit around viability assessments, and particularly, and you'll all be familiar if you work in development and acquisition, you'll all be familiar with the notion of viability assessments, and Jack will tell us about Cambridge's approach later on, no doubt. But what I want to particularly pick out is how viability assessments might be slightly different in the context of a housing revenue account compared to what might be a straightforward kind of developer viability assessment. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that, if that's okay. A little bit around new build acquisition, regen and funding, and particularly drawing distinctions between the different funding routes that can support investment in the HRA. And then finally, just a quick sum up around how we might measure the success of the programmes that we deliver. On the right-hand side there is a map of those authorities in England that have HRAs in the green and those that don't in the brown. You'll all be familiar, I'm sure, with the fact that not everybody is a stockholder anymore, and where there are limited stock holdings in the authorities that transferred their housing to a housing association back in the day, we don't have to open an HRA unless we have more than 200 homes, and that's the current limit set by MHCLG. Now, so around half of English local authorities own stock, and if you own stock, then you must operate, and more than 200 homes, you must operate a separate ring-fenced income and expenditure account called a housing revenue account. Now, for almost a century, the housing revenue account was part of a national housing programme. So even though each council had an HRA, it was very much part of a national housing programme. And we had various systems of subsidy and support and support for borrowing and investment in order to build all of the council housing that we did between 1919 and the turn of the century, turn of the millennium. But what I wanted to pick out in particular was that from 2012, you might have heard of the phrase self-financing. And that's when the national system of council housing and the National Housing Programme was abolished. And we gave an opportunity for people an opportunity for local authorities to run their own HRA according to their own decision making. So that's what we call kind of self-financing. Now, when we first did the self-financing deal back in 2012, the government imposed a cap on the debt that we could borrow, on the amount that we could borrow to invest in new builds. So even though we could take decisions locally around rent income and how we spent our rent income, we were faced with a cap on the total amount of debt that we could borrow. Now, that debt cap was removed in October 2018 by Theresa May, if you remember, at the Tory party conference. And since that day, we now have all the self-financing tools needed to be able to deploy the resources that we have within the HRA, whether that's to invest in our existing stock, invest in service delivery, and or to deliver in new supply, whether through development, regeneration or acquisition. So I say this only to say that there is no barrier from a legislative or statutory point of view. We have this system of prudential borrowing. That's borrowing for investment as long as it is deemed prudent, and it's prudent in the eyes of the Section 151 or the finance director, the Section 151 officer or finance director of the local authority. But we have no legislative or statutory barriers. Our only barriers really are on whether we've got the cash, whether we've got the resources, whether we've got the capability and capacity to undertake investment. Now, some of those techniques which we work on to understand what opportunities we have to make investment are called prudential indicators or capacity metrics or measures. If we move on to the next one, I'll show you an example of one authority which is based in the north of England, which is expressing or referencing a viable housing revenue account business plan. The grey bars there indicate the forward forecast of borrowing for the next 30 years. You can see a little bit of an increase in the borrowing in the first few years, for example. And then the lines indicate an expression of interest cover. Now, without getting too technical, interest cover is the extent to which net rent income is sufficient to cover your interest payments on your debt. So that's like having, I don't know if you pay mortgage or pay a rent, having net disposable income, which is at least more than the amount that you need to pay on your interest or your debt costs. And it shows how investment in the stock and services can be covered and to leave headroom for investment in new supply over the next 30 years. So in our particular example here, our green line is a minimum interest cover metric of 1.25. That's very similar to those that are operated by housing associations. And the orange line there is the forward forecast of interest cover over the next 30 years. And as you can see, the difference between the orange line and the green line is the additional capacity for investment over the next 30 years. So you can see in this particular example, which is a viable looking HRA business plan, we see increased capacity for investment over the next 10 years, and that continues to rise over the following period. So if you're this authority, you've got bags of investment potential, bags of capacity to potentially put into new build regeneration, as well as extra investment into your existing stock. Now, interest cover is our main kind of theme, if you like, in terms of measuring capacity for investment in the HRA. There are other measures, debt to turnover, which is like a kind of income ratio, if you like, kind of 5 times. Debt can be no more than 5 times turnover, similar to kind of, if you're borrowing for a mortgage, you can't borrow more than 5 times your income or 6 times your income, something like that. We might say financing cost as a percentage of rent income and set a target of, say, 20 to 25%. So no more of rent income, no more than rent income. No more than 25% or 20% of your rent income could be consumed on paying interest costs. So those are a couple of examples, but interest cover, because everything is in there. So all of your net rent income, so your rent cost, your rent income, your additional income, your costs, your operating costs, your management, your maintenance, your major repairs, because all of the factors of the business plan are captured into the interest cover calculation, we tend to focus on that because it captures all of those elements and levers. So in this particular case, as you can see, we've got bags of future investment. If we move on to the next example, which is an authority that is just under a little bit more pressure. So this is an example of a tight-looking housing revenue account business plan, and particularly in the early years. And you can see on the grey bars here in this particular example, there is a massive amount of additional borrowing over the next few years in order to meet decent homes or to bring the existing stock up to standard, as well as continue a new build programme. And that orange line of interest cover is below the theoretical minimum of 1.25 interest cover for as expressed by the green line. So what this is really saying is we haven't got a lot of additional capacity in the next few years, but we have rising additional capacity further on down the line. As you can see, the business plan here borrows lots of money for the first 15 years and then looks to try and repay some of that money or much of that money over the next 15 years. So this shows how net income can still cover interest costs in the short term and long-term capacity does grow, but there is little or no headroom in the short term. And so one of the questions just to have a think about is, can this authority in the first 7 or 8 years bring forward more new build programmes? Because there doesn't seem to be the capacity within the business plan in order to do that. And we'll answer that question, I think, as we go through the rest of the session. So which is more common then? This well-financed Banks of Future Capacity Authority, or if we go to the second one, this authority with constrained capacity in the first 10 years. Not necessarily anything other than a rhetorical question, so please don't put, 120 answers in the chat. But I would say, from my experience of working with local authorities around the country on their business plans, particularly in this current period, and in the likely future period around enhanced regulation, around pressures on repairs and capital investment for the existing stock, about pressure on inflation applying to management and maintenance costs, I would say that the majority of HRAs are more likely to be in the second position rather than the first position. That's not to say everybody, but the majority, I think, would be in the second position. So the key thing in terms of using HRAs for new build and for additional investment in new supply is basically to make sure that it all stacks up from the get-go. So in the national HRA position, we have significant pressures on the HRA. Inflation on costs has outpaced rent increases. We had a rent cap last year, of course. We've got increased demand and need for repairs, particularly on damp and mould, and we've got increased capital costs. The chart then shows the turquoise bars as our estimate from working with a number of authorities during the course of this last year on what we need to invest in the stock over the next few years. And the next 30 years, so a big kind of upfront investment in the first few years, followed by a long-term increased investment compared to the funding that we have available. And what this means is that many HRAs are under pressure and will need to focus pretty much all of their resources, their existing resources, on their existing stock. And just to note that notwithstanding authorities 1 and 2 in our examples, the prognosis for a very small number of HRAs is really quite challenging indeed, particularly in London and the big cities where there are lots of fire and building safety investment liabilities arising from having lots of new build and lots of tall buildings, high rise and high rise stock. So just to take that on a stage further, the red line there shows the national HRA forecast that we did for the Local Government Association a few months ago. You're not misreading that, folks. It is diving into deficit in the next few years, and then only in the next kind of 5 or 6 years is then recovering to start to generate surpluses. So with rent increases at CPI plus 1% and with convergence allowed back to formula rent averaged at 10 years, we can gradually get back into an overall surplus position. But we do have average deficits before average surpluses. So when we're thinking about, your authorities will be thinking about the rent policy debate over the next couple of weeks, the rent consultation that came out after the budget, on whether we go with CPI plus 1 for 5 years or for 10 years, and whether we think about any additional measures on rent increases that we might need to think about in terms of viability and sustainability for the HRA nationally and locally. That rent policy debate, I think, from my experience in working with authorities around the country, is largely around making sure that HRAs are able to, survive into the medium term with the liabilities and challenges associated with the existing stock. On average, it's average deficits before average surpluses, but many will have some capacity, and all will be able to build or acquire if it's viable to do so. So even in the context of a deficit forecast, we may still be able to generate additional capacity for new build, particularly if we're in the context of something that's viable from the very start. And so I wanted to just kind of take you through how we might be thinking about that over the next few years, because we shouldn't necessarily abandon all idea of new build or regeneration or acquisition in the face of challenges with the existing stock. And hopefully we can talk through over the next kind of 5 or 10 minutes what that might look like for you in terms of bringing forward schemes for the future. So if we just move on to the next one. So there are 3 principal implications of the pressures on the HRA. First of all, many are scaling back on new supply in total. Secondly, many are deferring programmes and schemes to further on down the line so they can deal with their challenges on fire and building safety or decent homes in the next few years. Or thirdly, we see lots of authorities switching from development to acquisition, removing some of the development risk and the forward funding that you might need to incur when we're developing as opposed to acquiring. But even in the most pressurised HRA scenario, the addition of some new supply is seen as essential, and members, as we know, are always positive about new build and acquisition programmes. So here's the crunch question then, guys. Can new build and acquisition programmes continue if the rest of the HRA is under so much pressure? And the key here, I think, is in these 3 or 4 key areas. So first of all, this is maybe around de-risking development, understanding how we can deliver development in a scenario in which some or more or much of the risk around development has been passed over to partners or to the private sector for new methods of delivery. And how can we share resources, perhaps, in order to deliver better value for money in development, whether we do that through combined or mayoral authority economies of scale? And how can we look for different forms of partnerships in terms of delivery, where some of that risk is taken on, perhaps by developers, by the private sector, or by housing association partners? But the fundamental rationale and reason for continuing a programme and the fundamental kind of basis for doing so would be that schemes, whether they're new supply or whether they're new development or whether they're acquisition, are viable from day one, viable from the get-go. And the key thing there is that we're not drawing upon any resources from the rest of the HRA in order to cross-subsidise our new build programme. Because logically, if we try to draw on resources from the existing stock and the existing cash flows and assets within the HRA, at a time when those assets and those properties and though that existing HRA is under financial pressure, then we think we're going to have to kind of claw back or pull back on new build programs or new supply programs. So the point I guess I'm trying to make is that there is no reason why we can't continue to finance the development and acquisition of new supply at scale in the HRA, providing we can get it viable and sustainable from day one, and we don't draw on existing resources within the HRA that may not be there. So how might we assess viability from the get-go or viability from day one? and I guess this will be more than familiar to you all. I mean, the usual appraisal models and techniques used by developers may not apply straightforwardly to the HRA, but that is not a reason for not assessing viability. So I've listed a few things there where the approach to assessing viability within the HRA is not the same as your Arguses and your Provals and all of your standard kind of development appraisal techniques. Not that those aren't very, very useful in terms of understanding the overall viability of the development as a standalone development, but in the context of the HRA, there are some specifics that we need to address. So the first of those is we need to allocate resources for major repairs from day one. Most development appraisals will not allocate resources for sinking fund or major repairs until year 11 or year 6 or something like that. But we need to allocate resources for major repairs from year 1 in an HRA context because of the depreciation mechanism, and we're having to transfer resources into the major repairs reserve. Secondly, most development appraisals techniques will capitalise development during the development interest during the development phase. But in the HRA, we are unable to do that because of the vagaries of the statutory and legislative rules within the HRA. We can't capitalise HRA interest if we're borrowing in the HRA during the development period. So that means the HRA is going to be cross-subsidising until the properties are built and stabilised. But we do have an opportunity for marginal costs within the HRA, particularly for housing management, but also for repairs. And when we're thinking about costs for housing management, the size of the scheme is really important. If it's simply a handful of properties, are we really going to incur any additional management budgets as a result of building or acquiring those properties? And of course, another really positive thing about operating in the HRA is the opportunity for marginal interest costs. So the overall average HRA interest rate across the country is just less than 4%. PWLB rates at the moment for borrowing are over 5.25% over 50 years, for example. But when we're assessing the implications of undertaking a particular scheme, the likelihood is that we will be incurring interest at the average marginal cost, at the average cost within the HRA, rather than at the current rate of PWLB. Hang on a second, Abby. At the current rate of PWLB interest. In other words, if we're going to go out and borrow £10 million at 5.25%, by the time we've added that into the overall HRA, we might only be incurring an extra little bit over 4% on average. So that's a really important consideration and plays to how your authority might operate the average interest charges to the HRA. So we've got some standard metrics and hurdles over there on the right hand side. All of these I'm sure will be familiar to you: net present value, internal rate of return and loan payback. So how do we do this in terms of time period? Do we go 30 years, 40 years, 50 years or longer? My sense is that most people are at 50 years at the moment. I mean, there are a few authorities that still go at 40 years, but of course it's really challenging to get stuff away viability and sustainability-wise within 40 years with the way things are at the moment. So we tend to go for 50 years, and in some cases I've seen 60 years, but the most common approach is 50 years because that's the longest borrowing period for people who will be borrowing. We look at net present value before subsidy. So what does it look like in terms of, what do we need in terms of grant or in terms of subsidy for the scheme? And we look at it after subsidy. And the key question here is, do you want your net present value after subsidy to be above zero? Many authorities go for a net present value marginally negative on the basis that we can't really get to zero or above zero or positive with the assumptions that have to be made in the current climate. So we find many authorities go for a kind of accept a marginal negative. That has to be seen, of course, in the context of not drawing upon pressurised resources in the rest of the HRA. For internal rate of return, what's a sensible minimum? I mean, anything above sort of 6% is absolute kind of good to go. 5% would be par. Anything above 4% might still be appropriate, but you're kind of your par sort of 50-year internal rate of return, generally around 5 to 6%. And then on low payback, again, we look to do 50 years, maybe sometimes 60, but the overwhelming majority 50 years to go with the the maximum length of the PWLB loan. And of course, the loan payback can be measured right from the get-go, from the start of development, or can be measured from when the stock is PC'd or stabilised and earning rent, and generally it would be from that second point. So just a couple of examples then on HRA specifics. So this is an example of a scheme that is viable in the conventional sense. On the left-hand side, you can see we're borrowing up to just over 4 million in the first few years, and then we're PCing, and then we're stabilising the debt, and then future net rent income is able to repay the borrower within 40 years and deliver considerable value to the HRA over the long term. But whilst the chart in the top left-hand corner shows an overall sort of conventional approach to development appraisal, what it does show is the need to borrow additional funding or to making effectively cash flow deficits in the first few years after PC. And you can see on the right-hand side there, I've identified the same scheme where we don't capitalise the interest and we incur the interest in the HRA over the early years. And you can see the orange bars there show the deficit development interest, which is up to around £100,000 over the first couple of years, and then a marginal deficit interest in the first few years following PC. So we pay back a little bit. We pay back pretty much within the same time period, maybe just a year early. But this deficit interest point, that requires HRA subsidy for that period. And the point I'm trying to make here is that we just need to, we're not saying no, don't do this, but we just need to be really clear and understand how that deficit interest hits the HRA rather than the conventional top left chart there, which would say, yeah, we're all fine, let's crack on. So the key here is minimising cross-subsidy implications whilst protecting viability overall. And then the other one I just wanted to just very quickly pick out was the importance or the implications of using marginal costs for management and maintenance. So this is an example of a scheme using a conventional approach to operating costs, say £1,500 per unit per annum for management and maintenance. And you can see we pay back in 43 years and we've got rising debt up to about 17 years. Our marginal approach on the right-hand side assumes no additional management costs and economies of scale on repairs costs down to a total of £600 per unit instead of £1,500. And you can see that on the right-hand side, we pay back at year 35 and that we don't incur any additional borrowing in that early period after PC. So I exemplify this not to make the not to sort of to state the blindingly obvious, but if we were using top left assumptions and our hurdle was 40-year payback, that scheme would fail. But if we use top right assumptions, marginal assumptions, and our hurdle was 40 years, that scheme would pass. So really worth thinking about the way in which we apply realistic estimates of management and maintenance costs going forward. So finally then on funding routes, as far as possible, we're aiming for schemes to wash their face from day one. In practice, that's pretty difficult in many cases, but the aim is to minimise the impact on the rest of the HRA. So what are the options and opportunities for funding routes? Well, we have the AHP, as Lisa mentioned. We have other Homes England and Greater London Authority grants, as Lisa also mentioned. We also have the availability of right to buy receipts, although these may become more restricted since right to buys may reduce as a result of the restriction of discounts, despite us being able to keep 100% of those receipts. And then we have the LAHF program. So in the three boxes there, I've just got some opportunities to think about the relative positives and adverses and issues and factors affecting each of those funding routes. So AHP grant rates could be higher, but they do reflect a stack up from day one. But do they reflect a stack up from day one? In other words, we may be able to get social rents at 100 grand a unit or 80 grand a unit, but will that still be able to support a viability assessment? Do they reflect the fact that housing associations have traditionally been able to cross-subsidise from capacity within their business plans? The key here is, notwithstanding this is a Homes England webinar, Homes England grant rates may be better reflective of housing association ability to cross-subsidise than the fact that local authorities may not be able to. There's no track record of delivery for local authorities, and we have no strategic partners at the moment, which I think was one of the reasons why the Local Authority Housing Fund programme is seen as much more flexible, speedy in terms of delivery. We can apply variably to meet need for new build and or acquisition, and we could have the potential to reduce or eliminate any cross-subsidy from the rest of the HRA. So the LAHF programme is ease of access, open to all, and is generally seen as a much more flexible approach. And then finally, we have our one-for-one right to buy receipts. These have been hamstrung by complex rules and returns over the years. Those rules have generally been around match funding, caps on acquisitions, and the time taken to deliver schemes. Had to deliver it in 3 years and then 5 years, and can we really realistically deliver on time? So none of this programme has been sufficient to return one-for-one replacement. It averages around 43% over the last 12 years. However, one-for-one right to buy receipts are the most flexible route, except for the acquisition cap, which we know is under consideration. But one-for-one receipts are the most flexible route open to an HRA. We can commit 100% of funding right to buy to all of our new build or acquisition, and there is no need for bidding. We have it within our gift to reinvest those receipts as we see fit. So I just wanted to pick out that AHP is great. It's got a massive amount of money behind it, but we do need to think about how we can make that a little bit more sensitive to the local authority experience. The LARF programme is seen as very flexible and positive, and right to buy receipts, although they are diminishing likely in number, still remain the most flexible resource. In terms of measuring success, got 3 things here. Despite a rush for right to buy applications up to the 21st of November, we are likely to get a big drop of sales from next year onwards. MHCLG estimates 1,700 a year. That's much fewer than 2,000, the 2,000 or so that we had prior to 2012. Just about 0.1% of stock loss across the country. This might give a genuine opportunity to replace sold stock, and a net growing HRA is a key strategic planning objective. That's a big measure of success for me. Can we start HRAs growing again now that our right to buys are likely to fall right down? Overall, a measure of success is a business plan, also a business plan with greater surpluses after 30 years, but that does not unduly press sustainability in the early years and draw on cross-subsidy from the rest of the HRA. And the third measure of success may be around the ability to address temporary accommodation challenges in the HRA and not the general fund, because we have flexibility in allocations and lettings, and we can switch between uses, and we can switch between TA and long-term let. So 3 measures of success there. Can we get a net growing HRA? Can we have an HRA with greater surpluses? And can we reduce the temporary accommodation cost to the local authority when we're thinking about delivering our new build programme? So conscious it was quite a lot to get through there, and I've gone over a little bit on my time. I do apologise for that, Lisa. Hopefully we can get, and I see a load of questions have come in through the chat. So I'll hand back to you, Lisa, if that's okay.
Thank you, and we'll hand straight over to our next presenter, and then we'll come back to questions at the end. So, Jax, over to you.
All right, morning all. Hopefully, I have a decent segue through from Steve's cover, but I think I'll focus on the practical points. But I think it's really kind of going to be reiterating a lot of what he has already said. So, if we go to the next one, please. So, our focus to date, obviously, is the LAF program. the council's been engaged since round one. We've done now 37 homes delivered out of a original target of 34 across rounds 1 and 2. And just to say, we're not master negotiators or anything when it gets to that figure. I think the saving grace for us was that our needs analysis indicated a couple of smaller homes that were needed, and that allowed us to bolster those numbers a little bit. Just to put that into perspective, it's quite a drop really compared to what the council is already doing, and that's part of why we were successful. So we recently, or the last 2 years, started a 1,000 homes housing program on the completion of a 500 homes program, and we've delivered now directly about 630 council homes through a joint venture partnership. And really, sort of the key takeaway that I'm going to get to with all of this is that we've been successful because we've been in a place that we could just jump on things very quickly and move them forward. Can you go to the next one, please? Yeah, so a bit of a mixed pipeline. The previous photo was a brand new development, 75 council affordable homes. We took 16 of those into this program for delivery, and the remainder was open market acquisitions throughout Cambridge. And we did, just to give a nod to that, because I know it's quite a focus of round 3, we did look at modular housing delivery. There were a number of problems, obviously, with round 1 and round 2 in terms of timeframes set for delivery. And for round 3, we did look at it again. I think there's 2 very key points why we didn't do that. The one is it relies on having land availability. While we do have some small pockets, they are sort of, they're there for a reason. They're quite difficult to develop. And as such, it didn't really shorten timeframes or offer significant opportunity. And it was felt better that doing acquisitions and getting additional freeholds into the HRA was a better pursuit. And the other one, which is a tricky point of modular delivery, is it's very difficult to make it non-bespoke in a city like Cambridge with a lot of conservation context. And once you start looking at design potential for specific sites, you get into the same sort of delivery timeframes as what you do for traditional build. For delivery, we did as much as we could in-house. Luckily, we had some RICS certified surveyors that we could rely on, but we have done a bit of a mix in terms of getting separate valuations and things, using people that are active in the city, just to make sure that we get best value for money on the purchases. And one of the key things there was we also very specifically targeted ex-council stock for 2 main reasons. One is that they're a known quantity. So all of our internal teams work on similar buildings on a day-to-day basis. We've got a good understanding of what they are and what they offer the council, and what their maintenance requirements are. And secondly, it's again, it starts to sort of reacquire areas that have been lost through right to buy over time. And that's a key aspect, especially if you're looking long term at, not now, but 20, 30, 40 years away from now, we'll start having to look at regeneration, and having those large areas of freeholds is a very important point to look at. Next slide, please. So again, our keys to success. Luckily, we're in a really good position to make the most of things. The 2 main questions, which were, how do you get people into the city, and how do you get your budgets approved? They really were in a good place to start. So as I've mentioned, we have a housing program that's been running consistently since 2017. There's an allocated budget annually, and the key one there is there's an unallocated budget annually. So along with rolling through schemes that are acknowledged and approved, we do the financial due diligence every year to have a pipeline of schemes and a budget approved that we can draw down. And that touches back to what Steve was saying, really, in terms of your interest rates and headroom, and where the council is needing to be. So what we do is we work close with our finance colleagues. We review that twice annually, and we make sure that there's a budget allocation rolling across that can be drawn down to bring forward schemes as needed, and as funding becomes available. The second point is Cambridge has been very vocal about being a city of sanctuary. There was an existing pledge to rehome 200 refugees families by 2025, and that was renewed last year to a further, I believe 10. But that's answered any questions that there may be coming through in terms of influx onto the housing register and how that can be managed. For all of the LAF programs, there's been very key focus on refugees, temporary accommodation, and we had all the pledges and requirements in place to show that those were needs that needed to be addressed with or without funding, and that making the most of the funding will put us in the best place to do so. Next slide, please. So, I think this is sort of really the key point here is everything that Steve has been saying is about managing the HRA account, and we would back that completely. I think you do. There's the general way of doing things is you have a project management team or a delivery team, and it's quite divorced from the finance team. Those need to be put together and work closely. And the second thing is on funding. There's lots of different routes of funding. I haven't even put in here the RSAP, Rough Sleeper Accommodation Program. There's another one, the One Public Estate Brownfields Land Release Fund, which we rely on heavily as well. But we try and keep those quite bespoke and not intermingled really when we look at scheme delivery. And I've seen a lot in terms of what every time there's an FAQ for a LAF round, one of the first questions is, can you mix funding? And I think the key thing that we try and rely on there is not to do that. Try and keep everything separate as much as you can, and have the accounting very clear in terms of where you have put in funding and from what source, so that if something like this comes forward and you have the opportunity, it's very easy to go back, review, and then reallocate as needed. And I think that's part of why we've been successful. In the 16 new builds that we put into this program, they had originally been allocated for right to buy receipts. And in order to make sure that this happened and this was successful, we went and reallocated, worked with our finance colleagues to do what needed to be done with the accounts to make sure that there was no cross-subsidy across those different packages. But I think that's really the key thing. We as I've said, we've worked with a number of different funding regimes, and just keeping them very clear. Don't allocate where you don't need to. Keep something in reserve and make sure that you're ready to take the benefit of these opportunities as they come forward. Especially noted, I think everyone on the call notes it, that the LAF funding, the bespoke funding, is generally at a higher rate that we would normally see on the affordable housing program. So it's very important that you have an opportunity you can draw down as needed. I've mentioned the target and ex-council stock, so I'm not going to go on that one again. If we can go to the next one, please. Mitigation and constraints, because these are the key aspects that you really need to take cognizance of. I'll start with the lower one first. I think it's quite an easy one. When you're looking at especially acquisitions on the open market, sometimes even the new builds, if you're buying a package, one of the key considerations is existing backlogs and work backlogs for voids, EPC works, things like that. We've been very careful to involve our assets team. So one of the first things we do is we go and review a property with them, just to make sure that what we're not doing is loading a heavily burdened team already with additional works. And that has helped us significantly. The other side of that is voids backlogs. That is a concern generally. But we have also seen that there's generally a delay from the Home Office in allocating families. So it's worth considering that and having those discussions internally to make sure that you've got a full understanding of what that means for your timeline. And that then feeds back into what you're modeling for your viability. And that's what I'm stringing back to that first one is I think viability is key, and kind of what Steve has been saying previously. We have two tiers, really. So we have the formal HRA business plan that gets reviewed twice a year. That has its ongoing financial model running in the background for that. But additional to that, we run scheme-specific viability models for every project that comes forward. This is no exception. Just touching on some of the things that Steve noticed, we do tend to look towards a 40-year model, trying to target a 5% interest rate return. Whether we get that or not is a different thing, and that sort of gives a nod to sort of social value and things like that. But the first port of call is to model it out, see what it looks like, take the decisions internally in terms of what value additional you'd be putting on that, and then model that into the HRA and make sure that it still holds and it can be carried. But that is always the first thing we do. And it's useful to do that on a scheme by scheme approach to acknowledge exactly how things are performing. And then you can roll that into a larger program or a full business model approach. And it gives you a much better picture of how things work in the long run. Rental tenures as well. The council's adopted 3 varied rental tenures, but we tend to start off at around about an LHA, 60% of market capped at LHA. But where we can, and again, subject to that viability monitoring, we do try and increase our delivery of social rents as well. But again, that all feeds into that middle business plan and making sure that you've got a full picture, and all the informants is a really key point to that. And I think that's all I had to say as a short summary. So back to Lisa.
Great, thank you very much to both our speakers today, and Steve, if you could join us back on camera as well, that would be great. And we'll just have a short Q&A before we wrap up today, just to post some of the questions you've asked in the chat. And I can see Steve's already answered lots of them in the chat already, which is great. But we'll post some of them here as well, so we've got them for the recording for anyone listening back as well, if that's okay. But I think first of all, there was a comment around the preference to capitalize development interest during development. Steve, did you want to say anything further on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When we're in the if we're developing within the general fund, we can capitalise it. There are capabilities within the classification of capital expenditure to allow us to do that within the general fund. Now, without getting too overly technical, there is something called the item 8 determination, which dictates the charging for financing costs and capital financing and debt costs between the general fund and the HRA. And the general view coming back from SIPFA is that the item 8 determination means that you can't capitalise interest in the HRA. The HRA would have to sustain that deficit interest in the development period. So whilst the questioner may have a preference, I suspect that if we're developing directly in the HRA, that's a potential barrier. One thing I would say is that if you were an authority that had previously thought that you were going to develop in the HRA, and now wish to develop in the general fund, with the HRA acquiring the affordable homes at the end of the scheme, that would be a way to do it. I don't know who asked the question, but if you've got a mixed tenure scheme, say you're delivering 100 properties and 40 of them for social rent, 60 for private sale. Rather than do that in the HRA and not be able to capitalise the interest, you could shift that scheme to the general fund. The general fund take the risk on the market sale and the reward on the market sale, and then you could reacquire the 40 social rent back into the HRA as an acquisition at PC, and that would then get around the capitalised interest point. But it's a bit technical, I'm afraid. But yeah, I'm afraid that's the advice from SIPFA, is we can't capitalise in the HRA.
No, that's fine. Thanks for clarifying that, Stephen. There were a couple of questions which I think you may have already answered in the chat, but specifically around the 200 units limit. So there was one around can the general fund hold more than 200 units for temporary accommodation? And then there was also one around when the limit's reached. Does the HRA need to be open when homes have been acquired by a non-social housing stock holding authority? So any more thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, so I think so. My answer to this is hopefully we've covered this in the chat as well, and people have got this as a kind of permanent record. But if you're just doing TA and it is only TA and it's for up to 2 years and it's on license with non-secure tenancies just for temporary accommodation, there's no need to be thinking about an HRA if you don't have one. Only when you get to a point where you're permanently discharging into a long-term tenancy that becomes a council house, and it's those that add up to the 200 rather than the TA.
That's great, thank you.
And there was a quick point about whether MHCLG officials were considering extending the 200, which my understanding is that there is. But if you are a non-stock holding authority, a non-HRA authority, and you are getting on for 200 stock, like permanently let stock, then always worth having a chat with the MHCLG team.
Yeah, and again, just for clarification, if this bit's not already been answered, there was a question about if you are way under 200 units, whether just use of general fund for general needs housing was the most appropriate route, and any thoughts?
Well, whether it's appropriate or not it's a moot. I mean, that's really down to your own individual. I mean, it is perfectly possible to have an HRA with 40 properties in it or 50 properties in it. I guess most people would consider that would be quite difficult to sustain, and that's why we have the 200 limit, I guess. But it isn't a matter for your individual authority as to whether you operate council housing in a general fund in an HRA with fewer than 200 properties. It's certainly possible to do.
Thank you. That's great. And another point that's come up, which you may want to expand on further, I know again it's been answered in the chat, was around the current issues which we're aware of some registered providers backing away from buying Section 106 properties, and that balance between the financial equation of when it's right to still intervene in the market.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this comes up and down the country. We find that there's big frustrations with housing associations pulling out of Section 106, not just from a local authority perspective, but also from a developer perspective as well. Developers struggling to get them away to RPs. I've said for a number of years now, if you have an HRA and you are able to acquire Section 106 properties, and for them to be viable pretty much from the start, providing you don't enter into too much, of a forward funding, and you're actually acquiring them either at Golden Brick or PC or something like that. I don't know why you wouldn't do that if you could make it stack up. I think local authority HRAs acquiring Section 106, particularly small schemes in their local area, I think is exactly what we should be using HRAs for. I know, Jacques,
just a way in there. I think it not to make the most of it. It's a perfect opportunity. To be honest, I think the hardest thing to do is to get the numbers into the HRA to make all those management costs and everything else stack up. And I think the key thing, which I mean, again, Steve points out all the time, is it needs to make financial sense to the HRA. That is the golden ticket, and you have to do it. But if you can do that modeling, you can incorporate those units, then you should do everything you can to maximize that. I think we struggle with that because we're still on both sides. We buy Section 106s, but at the same time, we are acting as a developer through a joint venture partnership. And it's a contentious thing because we understand how difficult the market is from the one side. But on the other side, if you can bolster your figures and you can make the most of that opportunity, then 100% you should go for it.
Okay, thank you. I think the other one, just for clarification again, I think this may have already been answered in the chat, was around using grant funding capital receipts to finance HRA capital expenditure, and if there any more to say on that, and whether it affected the ring fencing.
So general fund capital receipts, if providing there's no restriction, so if you've disposed of an asset and you've got a capital receipt, and providing there's no restriction in the context of that particular disposal, then that is a receipt for general use and they can be applied to the HRA capital programme.
Yeah. Okay, and then just to come back to that other one on tenure, so it was talking about open market.
Open market.
So if we're around cross subsidising and using open market to deliver boarding house objectives, so there is anything else to say on that one?
We're okay. Let me think about that, Lisa, and maybe just cast a written reply, which you can then get out to the participants.
That's fine. We will be leaving the chat open after the call, so I think if there are any other questions that we haven't got to, we'll do that, because we are just about on time. So if we could just have the slides back up, and just to say that we will have a take-home messages slide, which we will make sure is fully populated and send that out to you with the slides after the session. So thank you again to our speakers and to everyone for attending. Hopefully see some of you on the call this afternoon for our final session of the day. Thanks everybody, and goodbye.